If this story sends chills down your spine, hit like, drop a comment, share it with someone who loves true stories, and subscribe for more tales that'll keep your heart racing long after the screen fades to black. The hallway was washed in the pale hum of fluorescent light. A camera blinked silently above the door marked Delivery Room 6. It was 2:47 in the morning at Mercy General Hospital. The timestamp glowed red in the corner of the security feed. Inside the grainy frame, chaos erupted. Nurses shouting, alarms wailing, a woman's breath caught between pain and panic. "She's not breathing," someone cried. Another voice shouted, "Get the crash cart! The baby's in distress!" Just outside the doorway, a figure stood motionless. A woman in scrubs, calm, watching. She didn't rush to help. She didn't speak. She simply stared for 5 long seconds, then turned and walked away, her heels tapping softly down the sterile corridor. As she passed under the light, her face came into focus. Late 30s, sharp cheekbones, surgical badge, half covered by a lock of dark hair. The image froze. A man's voice broke through the silence, cold and deliberate. "What you're about to hear," he said, "is how a father discovered his daughter was murdered, and how he made sure every single person responsible paid the price." The screen went black, then 3 words appeared. 72 hours earlier, Elizabeth Carver believed her life was perfect. At 36, she'd finally beaten the odds. 10 years as a pediatric nurse, 4 years of failed IVF, 8 years of a marriage that looked solid from the outside. Now, 2 weeks from her due date, she had what she'd always dreamed of: a loving husband, a stable home, and a baby she could almost hold. The nursery was small, painted sage green, filled with folded blankets and soft light. She had chosen the name Robert if it was a boy, Catherine if it was a girl. Either way, it would feel like healing, a way to honor the mother she'd lost and the future she was building. Her husband, David Brennan, was charming and confident. He ran a medical device company called MediFlow Systems and spoke about innovation the way poets spoke about love. Liz adored that about him: the passion, the conviction, the sense of purpose. But lately something felt off. He worked late, slept little. When she asked how things were at the company, he'd smile too quickly and change the subject. She assumed stress. Everyone in healthcare was under pressure. Still, sometimes she'd wake at night and find him staring at nothing, eyes wide open, lips whispering silent calculations. She thought he was worried about the baby. He wasn't. 2 floors above downtown Chicago, in a steakhouse lit like a courtroom, William Carver cut into his dinner with surgical precision. Across from him sat David Brennan, perfectly groomed, visibly nervous. William was 62, a billionaire who had built Carver Pharmaceuticals from a garage lab and decades of sacrifice. His eyes were as cold as his knife. "I've been having you investigated," he said. David froze. "Excuse me?" "MediFlow Systems," William continued. "80 million in debt, FDA investigations, insolvency imminent." "That's business," David replied, forcing a smile. "Every company faces turbulence." William dabbed his mouth with a linen napkin. "Do you love my daughter, Mr. Brennan?" David's jaw tightened. "Of course I do." "Or do you love what she represents financially?" David pushed back his chair. "You have no right." William didn't look up. "I have every right. She's my child." There was a pause. Then the old man met his gaze, sharp, merciless. "I've been to hell, Mr. Brendan. It's where I send people who threaten my family." David left without finishing his drink. William called his security chief the moment the door closed. "Keller," he said, "increase surveillance on Brennan. Something's wrong." Liz never saw it coming. That evening, David came home with flowers and a stack of documents. "Just paperwork," when he said, "We're about to be parents. We need to update our wills, insurance, guardianship stuff, responsible adulthood." She smiled, exhausted, and signed where he pointed. She didn't notice the clause naming him sole guardian. She didn't notice the $15 million insurance policy. She didn't notice that the activation date was 60 days earlier, the exact window required to make it incontestable. "See," he said, kissing her forehead, "now we're ready for anything." And she believed him. In the basement parking lot of Mercy General, David met Dr. Patricia Moreno. Her hands trembled as she lit a cigarette. "I can't do this," she whispered. "Yes, you can," he said softly, slipping an envelope across the hood of her car. $150,000. Etch, and your debts disappear. What exactly are you asking me to do? Induce early. Say it's preeclampsia. If complications happen, you respond accordingly. Slowly. Her eyes widened. You're asking me to kill your wife. I'm asking you to let nature take its course. She took a long drag, then exhaled smoke and guilt. If anything goes wrong, this is on you. David smiled. Nothing will go wrong. Later that night, he went to Sienna Morgan's apartment, the nurse he'd been seeing for 2 years. She believed he loved her. She believed Liz was unstable. She believed he was trapped. Her pregnancy is dangerous, he told her. If she dies in labor, it'll be merciful. She's terrified of suffering. Sienna shook her head. That's horrible. She made me promise, David said gently. She said, don't let me suffer. Sienna's eyes filled with tears. You'd raise the baby? Our baby, he whispered, and she nodded, the sound of her heart breaking beneath the illusion of love. 2 weeks later, Liz woke to a rush of pain. David, she gasped, shaking him awake. My water broke. He blinked, instantly alert. Okay, stay calm. I'll grab the bag. We're going to Mercy General. She smiled weakly through the contractions. It's too early. 38 weeks is full term, he said. Everything's fine. As they drove through the empty streets, David texted, It's happening tonight. Be ready. Sienna replied, I'm on shift. I can cover delivery. The plan was in motion. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and fear. Liz was in active labor by 2:45 a.m. David sat beside her, pretending concern, whispering encouragement. De Moreno prepared the epidural. Her hands shook. Liz tried to focus on her breathing, but something felt wrong, a chill creeping up her spine. I feel heavy, she said. Not my legs, my chest. It's normal, Moreno lied. The monitor beeped. 96, 92, 88. Nurse, oxygen, Moreno ordered. Rachel, the attending nurse, adjusted the mask. Liz gasped, eyes wide. I can't breathe. David stepped back, feigning panic. It's okay, sweetheart. They are helping you. The door opened. Sienna entered. ICU backup, she announced. Rachel barely looked up, too busy checking vitals. Sienna moved behind the bed, hands quick and quiet. She kinked the oxygen tube, lowered the valve, blocked the view with her body. Liz's vision blurred. Her world narrowed to the face leaning over her, familiar eyes filled with tears. Wait now, she whispered. Sienna whispered back, trembling. He promised it would be fast. Then darkness closed in. A new voice cut through the chaos. What the hell is going on? Just as Jennifer Morrison stormed into the room, scanning monitors. Her O2 is 72. The line is kinked. She fixed it, restored flow, and barked orders. Get the crash cart. Reversal agent now. Within seconds, Liz gasped, coughing, oxygen flooding her lungs. Emergency C-section, Morrison shouted. The baby came out silent, then mercifully cried. When Liz woke an hour later, she was alive. Barely. David sat beside her, eyes wet with crocodile tears. I thought I lost you, he whispered. She turned her head, saw Sienna leaving the room, and she remembered everything. The next morning, David posted a smiling photo online. Almost lost them both, grateful for every moment. But Liz wasn't fooled. She had seen the truth, and she was going to call the only person who could help her. Her father. Elizabeth woke to the antiseptic glow of a hospital room. The hum of machines pressed into her ears like a warning that she was still here, still breathing when she shouldn't be. Her body ached as though she had fallen from a great height, her throat raw, her chest tight. But she was alive, and the small, steady cry she heard from the next room meant that her baby was too. For a moment, she almost let herself believe in miracles. Then David entered the room. He carried flowers, lilies, the kind her mother loved. He smiled like a husband in a commercial, perfect and hollow. His voice was soft, almost tender. You scared me to death, he said, placing the flowers by her bedside. The doctor said it was touch and go, but you're safe now. We're safe. Elizabeth stared at him. Her mouth was too dry to speak, her mind too fogged to argue. She could only listen as he played the part of the grieving, grateful man. every sentence polished, every pause timed. He leaned down and kissed her forehead. "Our son's in the NICU," he whispered. "He's small but strong, just like you." She wanted to scream, to tell him she saw it. The tube, the nurse, the lie. But her body betrayed her. Her lips barely moved, her breath still shallow. She could only stare into the face of the man who tried to murder her and wonder how she had ever loved him. That night, when the nurses changed shift and the ward quieted, she asked for her phone. Her fingers trembled as she dialed the number she hadn't used in 5 years. It rang once, twice, then a familiar voice, deep, controlled, older than she remembered. "Elizabeth." Her throat broke. "Daddy, I need you." There was a long silence on the line. Then, "Where are you?" "Mercy, General. Something happened. It wasn't an accident." William Carver's tone shifted, hard as stone. "Don't say another word, not to anyone. I'm coming." And before she could answer, he hung up. William Carver arrived 45 minutes later. The world seemed to part for him as he walked through the hospital. Security guards stepping aside, nurses lowering their eyes, administrators whispering his name. He didn't ask for directions. He knew how to find things. He always had. Outside Elizabeth's room, David stood like a gatekeeper, one hand in his pocket, the other holding his phone. He smiled when he saw the older man. "William, he said, I was just—" "Leave," William interrupted. David blinked. "Excuse me?" William didn't look at him. He turned to the man beside him, tall, square-shouldered, ex-military calm. "Keller," he said, "remove him." James Keller had been William's head of security for 15 years. He stepped forward with quiet authority. "Mr. Brennan, why don't you get some coffee? This is a private conversation." David hesitated, but something in William's stillness unnerved him. He left without another word. Inside the room, William closed the door behind him and looked at his daughter for the first time in half a decade. She was pale and frail, a shadow of the fierce young woman he remembered. Her eyes were haunted but alive, filled with the terrible knowledge of what had been done to her. He sat beside her bed and took her hand. It was cold, trembling. "Tell me," he said. And she did. Through tears and gasps and long, shuddering pauses, Elizabeth told him everything. The face of the nurse, the whisper. He promised it would be fast. The fear, the way David had watched her die with those lifeless eyes. She told him about the insurance papers she'd signed, the strange calm in his voice, the doctor's trembling hands. She told him about the length of a perfect marriage. When she was done, William sat very still. The clock on the wall ticked once, twice. He didn't speak for almost a full minute. Then, in a voice that carried both rage and reason, he said, "You're certain?" Elizabeth nodded. "I saw her, I heard her." "Then listen to me carefully," he said. "You're not going to the police, not yet." She stared at him. "What? Why?" "Because right now you have no proof. They'll call it postpartum confusion, oxygen deprivation, trauma. David's lawyers will bury you. The nurse will deny it. The doctor will claim it was a medical complication. And the media will call it hysteria." Tears filled her eyes. "So he just gets away with it?" William leaned forward, his gaze steady. "No, he doesn't. I will find the evidence. I will build the case. And then I will destroy everyone who touched you." Elizabeth looked at him, this man who had been more statue than father for most of her life. For a second, she saw something behind the coldness, not anger, not revenge, something deeper. Love, expressed in the only language he knew, control. "What do you want me to do?" she asked quietly. "I want you to act," he said. "Act like you remember nothing. Let him think his story worked. Let him believe you trust him." Her breath hitched. "You want me to pretend?" "Yes, you'll come to my house to recover. I'll say it's precautionary. He can visit, but only under my roof. Keller will handle everything else." Elizabeth hesitated, then nodded. "I can do that." William rose, brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, and pressed his lips to it, the first gesture of affection between them in 20 years. "I failed to protect you once," he said softly. "I won't fail again." 2 days later, Elizabeth and her newborn son, Robert, were discharged from the hospital and driven directly to William's estate. The mansion sat on the edge of Lake Michigan, stone walls rising like a fortress above the shore. To outsiders, it was luxury. To William, it was armor. David arrived an hour later playing the role of devoted husband. He kissed his wife's cheek, held his son, and thanked his father-in-law for being so generous. William barely acknowledged him. That night, in his private study, William convened a small meeting. Only 4 people were present: James Keller, a forensic accountant, a data analyst, and a private investigator. They sat around a long table under the watch of a single hanging light. William stood at the head of the table, hands folded. "You've all signed non-disclosure agreements," he said. "Breaking them will end your careers and your freedom. My daughter was the target of a murder attempt. 3 people are involved: her husband, David Brennan, a nurse named Sienna Morgan, and a doctor, Patricia Moreno. I want evidence. I want proof strong enough to destroy them publicly and legally. Do whatever it takes." The room was silent except for the scratch of pens. Then the work began. Over the next week, the team dug deep. The forensic accountant followed the money. The investigator followed the people. The analyst combed through phone records, bank statements, and surveillance footage. Keller coordinated everything, his loyalty to William absolute. After 7 days, they reconvened. David Brennan's company, the accountant reported, is collapsing. $80 million in debt. The FDA investigation is real. He's been moving money offshore, Cayman Islands accounts, set up 3 months ago, the same week he took out a $15 million life insurance policy on Elizabeth. The contestability period expired 1 week before the birth. William's jaw tightened. He planned it down to the hour. The investigator slid a folder across the table. He's also been seeing Sienna Morgan for 2 years. Hotel receipts, texts, photos. She's a surgical nurse at Mercy General. Divorced, no kids, had a stillbirth 3 years ago. Vulnerable, easily manipulated. He promised her the baby. The data analyst took over. As for Dr. Moreno, gambling debts totaling $147,000. 3 days before the delivery, she deposited $150,000 in cash. We have surveillance footage of Brennan's car at her bank that morning. William listened without expression, but Keller, who knew him best, saw the signs. A flicker in the eyes, a slight movement of the jaw, the restrained fury of a man planning a war. When the reports ended, William spoke quietly. "So we have motive, opportunity, and pattern, but not the act itself." "Not yet," Keller said. "There's no physical proof of oxygen tampering. The tubing was disposed of." "Then we make them create new evidence," William said. "We make them talk." Keller frowned. "You mean a confession?" "I mean a trap," William said. "The kind no one sees until it's too late." He turned to face the dark window overlooking the lake. The water was still. The reflection of the mansion lights shimmered across it like broken glass. "Men like Brennan always overestimate their intelligence," he said quietly. "He thinks wealth means wisdom. He'll try to negotiate, and when he does, I'll give him exactly what he wants. A deal too good to refuse." The next day, when David arrived for his daily visit, William met him at the door. "David," he said, almost cordial, "I'd like to speak with you privately tomorrow. 2 o'clock. My study." David hesitated. "About what?" "Your future," William said, "and Elizabeth's." David smiled, small, greedy, uncertain. "If this is about money," William cut him off with a faint smile. "Everything is about money, David. The question is how much yours is worth." As David walked back to his car, his mind raced with possibilities. He thought the old man was buying him out, maybe trying to secure his daughter's safety by paying for silence. He thought he was winning. He was wrong. That night, William stood alone in his study, a chessboard before him. He moved a single piece, the white queen, 3 squares forward. Check in 3 moves. In his mind, the game had already begun. The following afternoon, the air in William Carver's estate felt heavier than usual, thick with anticipation and something sharper, like the edge of a blade waiting to draw blood. The lake outside was frozen in a sheet of glass, its surface mirroring the cold precision of the man preparing to destroy his enemy. Inside, William sat behind his mahogany desk, the walls around him lined with books that spoke of medicine, law, and war. Every discipline he had mastered to maintain control of his empire. He poured 2 glasses of scotch, one for himself and one for David Brennan, who would arrive within minutes. Hidden among the room's dark wood and warm light, there were cameras, small, discreet, silent. One in the clock, one in the lamp, another embedded behind the molding above the bookshelves. Each one was connected to the adjoining study, where James Keller watched the live feed, headphones on, ready to record every word. When the intercom buzzed, William didn't look up. "Send him in," he said. David entered with the self-assured smile of a man who believed he was walking into a negotiation, not an execution. He wore a navy suit that didn't quite fit anymore, the subtle signs of strain showing in the tightness at his collar and the sheen of sweat beginning to form at his temples. "William," he said, extending his hand, "I appreciate you seeing me." William gestured toward the chair across from him. "Sit." David sat. William pushed one of the glasses toward him. "Drink?" David lifted it, taking a careful sip, waiting for the conversation to begin. William's tone was calm, conversational. "I'll be direct. I know you tried to kill my daughter." The words landed like a gunshot in the quiet room. David froze, then laughed, a short, nervous sound. "That's insane," he said. "Sit down," William repeated. The authority in his voice was so absolute that David obeyed without thinking. William leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable. "I know about the debts. I know about Sienna Morgan. I know about Dr. Patricia Moreno. I know about the life insurance policy. And I know that you're not nearly as clever as you think you are." David's pulse jumped, his composure cracking for just a second before he smiled again. "If you had proof, I'd be in handcuffs," he said. William's eyes didn't move from his. "If I wanted you in handcuffs, you would be. I'm not interested in justice. I'm interested in solutions." He slid an envelope across the desk. The sound of paper against wood filled the silence between them. David stared at it. "What's this?" "A deal," William said. "Inside is a legal agreement and a bank routing number. $10 million, untraceable, offshore. In exchange, you will sign over all parental rights to Robert, file an uncontested divorce, leave the country, and never contact my daughter again." David blinked, the idea working its way through his greedy brain. "You're offering me $10 million to disappear?" William nodded once. "I'm offering you your life." For a long moment, David said nothing. He leaned back, swirling the scotch in his glass. "10 million is generous," he said finally. "But let's be honest, William. Your daughter's worth a lot more than that." William's gaze sharpened. "Was?" David chuckled, not realizing how close he was to the edge. "Is, whatever. Point is, I'm walking away from a billion-dollar family. That's a big risk. Maybe we talk 20. William didn't respond. He simply watched him, the faintest hint of disgust in his eyes. David mistook the silence for negotiation. "Look, Isai," he continued, "we're both businessmen. You understand that sometimes marriage is a transaction. Your first wife, Catherine, she came from a pharmaceutical family, didn't she? That's how you got your start." The air in the room changed. William's voice lowered. "My wife was not an asset." "Of course," David said quickly, smiling again, trying to smooth over the words. "I'm just saying, sometimes love and business overlap. I did love Liz in my own way, but financially it was always going to end one way or another. I just chose the most profitable exit strategy." William's hand tightened around his glass, but his face remained still. "And what did that strategy involve?" David smirked. "You really want me to spell it out?" "Indulge me." David leaned forward, his arrogance swelling with every sip. "Fine." Mediflow was collapsing, investors gone, FDA breathing down my neck. But Liz, sweet, naive Liz, she was worth keeping around. Until she got pregnant. He laughed softly. That changed everything. Pregnancy was perfect. High-risk event, easy to disguise. If she died during labor, nobody would question it. I'd be the grieving husband, with a newborn heir and a direct line to the Carver fortune. William's voice was quiet. "The life insurance policy?" $15 million, David said proudly. "Triple indemnity for accidental death. Timed perfectly. You'd appreciate that kind of planning." "And the doctor?" Moreno, she was simple. He was addicted to gambling. 150 grand and she'd do anything. Called it a medical judgment call. Overdosed the epidural. Looks like a complication. Happens every day. William's knuckles turned white. And the nurse? David laughed again, the sound grating and cruel. Ah, Sienna. That one was beautiful. Tragic backstory. Lost a baby. Emotionally fragile. I told her Liz was unfit, unstable, that the baby deserved better. She actually believed she was helping. All she had to do was adjust the oxygen. Let Liz drift away peacefully. She even cried while doing it. He chuckled again, shaking his head. You know what's funny? She apologized to Liz while killing her. Whispered, he promised it would be fast. Can you believe that? The irony is almost poetic. William stood slowly, setting his glass on the desk. His voice was measured, controlled. You made one mistake, David. David looked up, smug. Oh yeah, what's that? You thought I was like you. At that moment, a soft click echoed from the wall behind them. A panel slid open, revealing a window of one-way glass. On the other side of it, James Keller stood beside Detective Sarah Walsh, her badge glinting under the dim light. A camera blinked red. Beside them, Elizabeth sat silently, tears rolling down her face. David turned, his color draining. What is this? William's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. This is the part where you realize you've been talking too much. Sarah Walsh stepped into the room, badge out. David Brennan, you are under arrest for attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and insurance fraud. David stumbled back, shaking his head. This is entrapment. You weren't coerced, she said calmly. You weren't under interrogation. You confessed voluntarily. William leaned forward, his eyes cold. You see, the offer was fake. The confession was real. The detective read his rights as Keller stepped closer to secure him. David struggled, his voice cracking between outrage and desperation. You'll never prove Sienna or the doctor were involved. It's my word against theirs. Elizabeth appeared in the doorway, her face pale but unflinching. You won't need to prove it, she said softly, because they're going to tell the truth themselves. David's eyes went wide. Liz, she shook her head. Don't. You tried to kill me. You tried to kill your own child. There's nothing left to say. As Keller led him away, David turned one last time toward William. You think you've won? This isn't justice. This is manipulation. You used your money to... William cut him off. No, David, I used my mind. You used greed. That's why I'm still standing. And you're not. The door closed behind him. Silence filled the room again, heavy but clean, like the air after a storm. Elizabeth sank into the chair opposite her father, her hands trembling. I heard everything, she whispered. Every word he said about me, about the baby. William walked to her, resting a hand on her shoulder. You needed to. You needed to know it was real, that you weren't crazy. She nodded, tears falling freely now. Thank you. For what? For believing me when no one else would. William looked down at his daughter, the woman who had nearly died because of his absence, and for the first time in decades, he allowed himself to feel something unguarded. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I should have been there sooner. Keller re-entered the room. Detective Walsh says the confession is airtight. The DA wants to move quickly. Good, William replied. Because we're not done. We still have the nurse and the doctor to deal with. He looked out the window again, the reflection of the lake glinting in his eyes like steel. They thought money was their weapon. They were wrong. Money isn't power. Control is. And with that, William Carver began the second phase of his revenge. The story of David Brennan's arrest spread through the city like wildfire. Every news outlet carried the same headline. Tech CEO charged in attempted murder of his wife. Photographs of him being led out of the Carver estate in handcuffs splashed across screens. His once confident smile replaced by the pale shock of a man who finally realized he had been outplayed. But for one person, the headlines were more than gossip. They were a death sentence. Sienna Morgan sat in her small apartment, watching the morning news with shaking hands. The coffee in her cup had long gone cold. The anchor's voice echoed through the room, describing the confession, the charges, and the possibility of additional accomplices. She didn't need them to say her name. She already knew it was only a matter of time. Her phone buzzed, unknown number. She hesitated before answering. Ms. Morgan, a man's voice said, smooth, professional, too calm. This is Gregory Hart, David Brennan's attorney. Her throat tightened. Is he okay? He's alive, but listen carefully. You're not implicated, not yet. They don't have evidence against you. She gripped the phone so tightly her knuckles whitened. What do you mean yet? David's under pressure, the lawyer said. The DA will offer him a deal to name accomplices. If that happens, he'll give them you to save himself. My advice? Get out of town. Lay low until we see where this goes. The call ended before she could respond. For a few seconds, the room was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Then panic hit her like a wave. She packed a small suitcase, stuffed cash into an envelope, and pulled out her passport. Mexico seemed far enough. She could vanish there, change her name, start again. But fear has a way of catching up before escape ever begins. By nightfall, she was standing at O'Hare Airport, her suitcase by her side, ticket in hand. The line moved forward slowly, each step echoing louder than the one before. She could almost taste freedom when a deep, even voice behind her said, Sienna Morgan. She froze. Turning slowly, she saw a tall man in a dark coat, his presence calm but unyielding. His eyes were the color of steel and carried the weight of someone who never needed to raise his voice to command obedience. Who are you? Who? She whispered. He held up a small leather case, revealing a badge that wasn't police but meant authority nonetheless. James Keller, he said, private security. Mr. Carver would like to speak with you. Her pulse raced. I don't have to talk to you. You're right, Keller said. But if you walk through that gate, I make one phone call to TSA. You'll be detained for carrying undeclared cash, $98,000 if I'm not mistaken. They'll find out soon enough where it came from. By the time you're released, David Brennan's lawyers will have already traded your name for leniency. Sienna's heart thudded against her ribs. What do you want from me? 20 minutes, Keller said quietly, in a private room. After that, you're free to go. She looked past him toward the line, toward the gate that promised escape. Then she nodded, her voice barely audible. Fine. The airport's VIP lounge was empty at that hour, the city lights spilling through wide windows, turning the floor into a mirror of gold and shadow. Sienna sat at a small table, her suitcase beside her. The door opened, and William Carver entered, immaculate in a black coat, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. Ms. Morgan, he said, his voice carrying the weight of something colder than anger. Sit down. She didn't move. What do you want from me? He set a tablet on the table and slid it toward her. The screen lit up, displaying photographs. Her and David together in hotels, text messages filled with promises and lies, timestamps that matched hospital schedules. This, William said evenly, is your life for the last 2 years. Phone records, credit card statements, your shift logs. You weren't assigned to the maternity ward the night my daughter went into labor. Yet you were there. Do you know what that makes you, Ms. Morgan? Sienna's breath came in sharp bursts. He told me she was sick, she said quickly. He said she might die anyway, that it would be mercy. William interrupted her gently, almost kindly. He told you what you wanted to hear. That's what men like David do. They use pain as leverage. He swiped to the next image, a bank deposit slip. $150,000 transferred to Dr. Moreno, 3 days before the birth. And this, he said, sliding again, is security footage from your bank parking lot the same night you withdrew $98,000 in cash. That's the money you're carrying in your suitcase right now. Tears filled her eyes. I didn't mean for her to die, she whispered. But you kinked the oxygen tube, William said. His tone didn't accuse, it stated. You turned the valve the wrong way. You watched her suffocate. Sienna covered her face with trembling hands. He said it would be fast. He said it was mercy. He said we'd raise the baby together. William let the silence sit between them. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but edged with truth. He lied, just like he lied to you about everything else. He tapped the tablet once more. The next image froze Sienna in place, a screenshot of David with another woman, his arm draped around her shoulders, both laughing in the sun. The date stamp was 3 months before the birth. Who is she? Sienna asked. Another nurse, William said. He told her the same things he told you. That he loved her, that you were unstable, that once his wife was gone, they'd start a new life together. You weren't the only one, Ms. Morgan. You were just the most useful. Her shoulders shook as she cried. He promised me a family. William leaned forward. He promised you a fantasy, and in return, you narrowly killed mine. She looked up at Doemi, her face blotched with grief. So what now? You turn me in? Destroy me? No, William said simply. I'm going to give you a choice. She blinked, confused. A choice? Option 1, he said, his voice steady as a verdict. You get on that plane. Within 48 hours, the police will name you as a co-conspirator. You'll be extradited, prosecuted, and sentenced. 20 years minimum. Your name, your face, your life, gone. He paused. Option 2. You testify against David Brennan and Dr. Moreno. You tell the truth, everything that happened, everything he told you. You cooperate fully. In exchange, I will ensure you receive immunity. You'll never work as a nurse again, but you won't go to prison. And when the trial is over, you'll disappear. New name, new start. I'll provide $250,000 to make sure you can actually live that new life. Sienna stared at him, unable to speak. Why would you help me? William's eyes softened, just barely. Because my daughter asked me to. Her voice cracked. She what? She said, and I quote, she was manipulated. She thought she was saving a life. Don't destroy her completely. Elizabeth believes that one terrible choice shouldn't define a lifetime. She sees weakness where I see guilt, but she asked me to give you mercy, and I always listen to my daughter now. Sienna pressed a trembling hand against her mouth. I don't deserve her forgiveness. You won't have it, William said quietly, but you can honor it. Tell the truth. Make sure David never hurts anyone again. For a long time, she didn't answer. The sound of airplanes rose and fell outside like distant thunder. Finally, she looked at him, eyes red but resolute. I'll testify. I'll tell them everything. William nodded once. Then sign this. He slid a folder toward her, a formal cooperation agreement drafted by his lawyers. She picked up the pen, her hand still shaking, and signed her name. When she finished, she looked up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. Why didn't you just destroy me? William's answer came without hesitation. Because you're not David. He preyed on your grief. You were weak, not evil. There's a difference. Sienna wiped her eyes and stood. What happens now? You'll meet with the district attorney tomorrow, William said. My team will handle your protection until the trial. After that, you vanish. She nodded, picked up her suitcase, and walked toward the door. Just before she stepped out, she turned back. Tell your daughter, I'm sorry, even if she never wants to hear it. William didn't move. She already knows, he said. That's why you're still breathing. Sienna nodded once, then disappeared down the corridor. When she was gone, Keller stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. You think she'll hold up under cross-examination? Yes, William said, watching the lights of a departing plane fade into the night sky. She's not lying anymore. Fear makes people falter. Guilt makes them truthful. Keller nodded. And Dr. Moreno? William's jaw tightened. She's next. He gathered the tablet and papers into a folder, sliding them neatly into his briefcase. The plan was moving exactly as he intended. Every piece on the board had found its place. People mistake my silence for mercy, he said softly. But mercy without consequence is chaos. I'm giving them both. Consequence for what they did, and mercy for what they could still become. Keller said nothing. He'd worked for William long enough to know that when the man began speaking like that, the storm was already gathering. Outside, the night deepened. The city below shimmered with 1,000 lights, each one flickering like a heartbeat. Some innocent, some guilty, all fragile. William Carver stood at the window, watching the sky swallow the last of the planes, and whispered to himself, 1 down, 2 to go. The casino floor glowed with the feverish pulse of neon and desperation. Chips clinked, cards flipped, and lives evaporated one bet at a time. Somewhere between the noise and the smoke sat Dr. Patricia Moreno. Her once steady surgeon's hands now trembled around a glass of cheap whiskey. The woman who had once delivered life for a living was now gambling away the last pieces of her own. She watched the dealer turn a queen and a five. The house won again. The dealer's expression was blank, mechanical. "Tough night, Doc," he muttered. Patricia forced a smile, though her insides burned. Story of my life. She had been coming to this riverboat casino almost every week since her suspension. Officially, she was under review by the state medical board after the investigation into Elizabeth Carver's near death. Unofficially, she knew her career was over. The money David Brennan had given her was gone, swallowed by the same debt she'd tried to escape. As she reached for another chip, a man's voice beside her said quietly, "You're out of luck tonight, doctor. The odds are terrible." She turned. The sight froze her. William Carver sat beside her, impeccably dressed, his presence calm and deliberate. He looked like a man who never needed to raise his voice to ruin someone's life. Her blood ran cold. "Mr. Carver," he smiled faintly, "I was in the neighborhood." She swallowed hard, her hands trembling. "What do you want?" "A conversation," he said, "somewhere quieter." Patricia stared at him for a long moment, weighing her options. She saw no bodyguards, no overt threats, just a man radiating authority. And something about the way he looked at her told her she wouldn't be leaving until he was finished. She followed him to a private booth overlooking the water. The casino's hum faded to a dull throb behind glass. William sat opposite her, setting a tablet on the table. "Let's begin with the facts," he said. "You accepted $150,000 from David Brennan 3 days before my daughter's labor." She stiffened. "You can't prove that." He tapped at the tablet. "Bank deposit record. Timestamp. Surveillance footage of Brennan's car outside your branch. And this?" He swiped to another image. "Your search history, epidural complications, how to induce labor early, respiratory failure after anesthesia." Patricia's face drained of color. "That's illegal to access." "So was what you did," William said softly. She sank back in her seat, covering her face with both hands. "He told me she was dying," she whispered. "He said she had a heart condition, that it was mercy to deliver early. He said—" "He lied," William interrupted. "My daughter's heart is fine. You didn't check her chart. You took his word because he paid you." Patricia's breath came in shaky bursts. "I didn't mean for it to go that far. I didn't think—" "No," William said, leaning forward. "You didn't think. You gambled. Not just with money this time, but with a life." Tears filled her eyes. "You think I don't know that? You think I don't wake up every night hearing her gasp for air?" William regarded her quietly. His voice, when it came, was measured but merciless. "You want absolution. I don't offer that. I offer truth." She looked up at him, broken. "Then say it. Say what you came to say." "I came to give you a choice," he said, "the same one I gave Sienna Morgan." Her expression flickered with confusion. "The nurse?" "She's cooperating with the DA. She testified that you administered 3 times the normal dose of epidural anesthetic. She's already signed her deal. If you refuse to cooperate, you'll face the full sentence alone." Patricia pressed a shaking hand to her forehead. "How do you even know all this?" William's lips curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "I make it my business to know everything." He leaned closer. "Choice 1. You fight. You claim innocence. You go to trial. You lose. 20 years in prison for attempted murder. Your children will grow up without you, and your ex-husband will never let them visit." He paused. "Choice 2. You plead guilty to reckless endangerment. You testify against Brennan. You tell the truth about the bribe. You serve 3 to 5 years, maybe less. Your children's college funds remain untouched." "I'll insure it." Patricia blinked through her tears. "Why would you do that? After what I did?" William's gaze softened, not in forgiveness, but in reason. "Because they didn't ask to suffer for your mistakes. I can ruin you without touching them. Or I can make sure they don't pay for your sins. The choice is yours." For a moment, Patricia said nothing. The sound of water lapped softly against the hull outside, a rhythm that seemed to measure her guilt. Finally, she whispered, 3 to 5? "If you cooperate fully," he said. "If you don't, you'll lose everything, including them." She stared at him, seeing not a man but a force, like gravity, inevitable and final. You're a monster, she said quietly. William nodded slightly. Perhaps, but I'm a monster who protects what he loves. Can you say the same? Her tears spilled over. I was desperate, she murmured. The debt, the casino. He cut her off gently. Desperation doesn't absolve betrayal. It only explains it. She wiped her face, straightened her shoulders, and took the pen he offered. I'll testify, she said. I'll tell them everything. William's voice lowered. That's the first honest decision you have made in years. She signed the document, her signature trembling across the page. When she was done, she looked up at him. What happens now? Tomorrow morning, Keller will escort you to meet with the district attorney. You'll enter your plea and make your statement. Patricia nodded slowly. And after that? You serve your time, he said, and when you get out, you start over. Quietly. She gave a small, bitter laugh. Outside the courthouse, the winter wind cut through the crowd. Reporters shouted questions. William ignored them all. Elizabeth walked beside him, holding her coat tight around her shoulders. It's over, she said softly. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. For him, yes. For us, it's just beginning. She frowned. What do you mean? William looked toward the horizon, the city skyline painted in cold gray light. Justice isn't a moment, Liz. It's a maintenance. Every day, you choose to keep the darkness from coming back. She was quiet for a while, then said, You sound almost like Mom. He smiled faintly, the first real smile she'd seen from him in years. She believed in redemption. I'm starting to understand why. That night, back at the estate, William stood on the terrace overlooking the lake. The water was still, the air crisp and quiet. For the first time in months, there was no strategy left to plan, no enemy left to dismantle. Only silence. Tears welled in Sienna's eyes as she brushed a strand of hair from Margaret's forehead. I'm trying, she whispered, every day. When the woman passed later that evening, Sienna sat by her side long after the nurses had covered the body. She wasn't crying for Margaret. She was crying for the woman she used to be, and the one she was still trying to become. That night, Sienna returned home to the small desk where she kept a stack of letters, each addressed to Elizabeth Carver, but none ever sent. They were written in uneven handwriting, dated week by week, charting the slow journey of repentance. Dear Elizabeth, one began, I see your face every night before I sleep. I hear your voice asking why, and I still don't have an answer good enough to live with. But I'm learning to live with the bad ones. I spend my days trying to give others the peace I stole from you. I don't expect forgiveness. I just need to believe redemption isn't impossible. Start over? After what I've done? You'd be surprised how many people have built redemption on worse foundations, he said. But that's your burden now, not mine. As he stood to leave, she called after him. Mr. Carver? He turned. She swallowed. Do you ever feel guilty for what you're doing? William considered her question, then answered with unnerving calm. No, guilt is for people who hesitate. I stopped hesitating the night my daughter almost died. He left her sitting there in the dim light, the contract before her, the weight of her choices pressing down like a judgment. The next morning, Keller delivered Dr. Moreno to the district attorney's office. The plea deal went through smoothly, her cooperation earning her a reduced charge and a shorter sentence. Within weeks, she stood before a judge, trembling but resolute, and admitted her guilt. I violated my oath, she said in a voice that shook. I accepted money to make a decision that could have killed a patient. She folded the letter carefully, placed it in the box with the others, and struck a match. One by one, she fed the pages to the flame. The firelight danced across her face, illuminating both the guilt and the fragile hope that coexisted there. When the last letter was ash, she whispered, I'm sorry, as she did every night. Then she sat in the dark, breathing, alive, and still trying. Across the country, in a quiet suburb outside Chicago, Dr. Patricia Moreno walked through the gates of a federal rehabilitation facility. She had served 22 months of her 5-year sentence before being granted parole for good behavior. The world outside felt both too bright and too loud. Her hair had gone gray at the temples, her posture more humble. She clutched a worn leather satchel. Inside were 2 letters from her children and a copy of the plea agreement she had signed under William Carver's watchful gaze. When she stepped outside, a car was waiting. Inside, Elizabeth was putting Robert to bed. Her laughter drifted faintly through the window. Soft, real, alive. William closed his eyes and let it sink in. He had won. But it didn't feel like victory. It felt like survival. He whispered into the night, not to God, not to vengeance, but to the memory of the woman who had taught him that love could exist even in ruthlessness. "It's done, Catherine," he said. "She's safe now." The wind moved over the water, carrying his words into the dark. The headlines came fast, relentless, and unending. Tech CEO sentenced in shocking murder plot. Billionaire father outsmarts would-be killer. Justice or vigilante? The Carver case divides America. The story had everything the media craved: power, money, betrayal, and revenge. Within days, talk shows debated Williams' tactics, podcasts dissected his motives, and social media crowned him both hero and villain. But inside the Carver estate, there was no celebration, only silence. Her ex-husband sat in the driver's seat, older, cautious, but not unkind. "You look different," he said as she climbed in. "I am different," she replied. "At least, I'm trying to be." They drove in silence for a while before he said, "The kids are nervous to see you, but they're happy you're home." Patricia nodded, staring out the window. "Tell them I'm nervous too." When they arrived at the house, her daughter ran out first. 16 now, taller, her eyes the same shade of dark brown Patricia saw in the mirror. The girl hesitated at the edge of the driveway before running into her arms. Patricia broke down instantly, holding her tightly, whispering over and over, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." Her son, now 14, stood back but smiled faintly. "Dad says you're working again." Patricia wiped her tears. "Not as a doctor. I lost that right. But I'm working at a clinic, helping with patient advocacy." He nodded. "That's good." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something close. She described the night of the delivery, her hands trembling as she spoke. "He told me to kink the oxygen line just slightly, said it would look like a malfunction. I did it. I watched her gasp for air. I told myself it was mercy, but it wasn't. It was murder." David's lawyer stood for cross-examination, his tone sharp. "Ms. Morgan, you were in love with my client, weren't you?" "Yes," she admitted. "And when you learned he was married, you were angry?" "I was heartbroken." "So this testimony, your words now, are they revenge?" Sienna looked directly at David. "No," she said. "This is redemption." The courtroom held its breath. Next came Dr. Patricia Moreno. Dressed in prison khakis, she walked slowly to the stand, her wrists unshackled only for testimony. Her voice wavered at first, but she steadied herself as she began. "I was the attending physician that night. I induced labor without medical necessity. I administered an overdose of anesthesia." Months later, Patricia stood at the front of a small lecture hall at the local university, speaking to a class of medical students. Her presentation was titled "Ethics in Crisis: A Case Study in Failure." She began without notes. "I'm not here to tell you how to be good doctors," she said. "I'm here to tell you how I became a bad one. Not through ignorance or lack of skill, but through fear. Fear of failure, fear of losing everything, fear of being seen as weak." She paused, looking at the faces before her, young, bright, full of ambition. "One day a man offered me a bribe, and instead of saying no, I said, 'Just this once.' That's the moment I stopped being a doctor. The moment I chose greed over humanity." The room was silent. "When I was sentenced," she continued, "I thought my life was over. But then something unexpected happened. The man whose daughter I nearly killed gave me mercy, not because I deserved it, but because he wanted my children to have a chance." William sat alone in his study, the fire burning low. The documents from the trial lay spread across his desk like ghosts that refused to rest. Every testimony, every confession, every photograph, all proof of how close he had come to losing everything. He should have felt vindicated, triumphant. Instead, he felt hollow. Justice, it seemed, had an aftertaste. Keller entered quietly, carrying 2 glasses of whiskey. "You haven't slept," he said. "Neither have you," William replied, his voice rough from too many sleepless nights. Keller set a glass in front of him. "It's over, you know. You got what you wanted." William stared into the amber liquid. I got what I needed, he said, not what I wanted. Keller frowned. And what did you want? William looked up, his eyes tired but sharp. A world where I didn't have to destroy a man to save my daughter. The two men drank in silence. The fire crackled, throwing long shadows across the walls. That mercy became my second chance. Don't waste yours. When the lecture ended, a student approached her. Dr. Moreno, she said softly, you're the first speaker who's ever made me scared to be careless. Thank you. Patricia smiled faintly. Fear can be useful, she said, as long as it leads to caution, not compromise. As she packed her things, she looked out the window at the city beyond the campus. Somewhere out there, Elizabeth Carver was living, breathing, thriving. Somewhere, William Carver was watching over her, perhaps still questioning where justice ended and mercy began. Patricia hoped they were at peace. She didn't expect to share it, but she prayed that her small acts, every patient she helped, every student she warned, would be enough to tip the scales just a little toward balance. One evening, as the sun dipped low, she sat at her kitchen table writing a letter. Mr. Carver, it read, you don't know me anymore. I'm not the woman you met in that casino. For a moment, neither spoke. The wind carried the sound of waves against the shore, soft and endless. Finally, Elizabeth whispered, you've changed, Dad. William looked at her, his face unreadable. No, I've remembered who I was supposed to be. Later, in the quiet of his study, he stared at the chessboard again. 3 pieces remained, 2 pawns and a king. He picked up one pawn and set it aside. Sienna Morgan, neutralized. He moved the second pawn beside it. Patricia Moreno, contained. Only the king remained. David Brennan. The game wasn't over yet. The trial was coming, and with it, the final reckoning. William poured himself a drink and gazed out the window at the lake, the night calm and endless before him. They say justice is blind, he murmured, but sometimes it just needs the right pair of eyes to guide it. He took a sip, the taste of victory sharp and hollow on his tongue, and whispered, checkmate is coming. The courtroom was a theater of tension. I've spent every day since then trying to earn the mercy you gave me. I don't gamble anymore. I teach. I volunteer. My children are growing into good people, better than I ever was. I don't expect thanks or forgiveness. I just wanted you to know your daughter's kindness changed more than one life. I hope she knows that too. She sealed the letter, addressed it to the Carver Foundation, and sent it without expecting a reply. In the quiet that followed, both women, Sienna and Patricia, continued to rebuild, each in their own fragile way. One sought redemption through service, the other through education. Both lived with guilt, but guilt had become their compass, not their prison. And somewhere far away, William Carver received the letter. He read it in silence, then placed it beside Sienna's in the same drawer. When Elizabeth asked what he was reading, he said only, proof that mercy isn't weakness. It's strategy with a soul. Elizabeth smiled faintly. Do you regret it? Keller finally asked. William thought for a long time before answering. Regret is a luxury. I acted because the law would have failed her. I did what fathers are supposed to do, protect their children, no matter the cost. But the thing about cost, Keller, is that you never know the full amount until the bill comes due. Keller nodded slowly. And what's due now? Peace, William said, or something close to it. Upstairs, Elizabeth watched her son sleep. Robert's small chest rose and fell in rhythm with the faint hum of the nursery monitor. Every time she looked at him, she was reminded of how fragile life was, how easily it could have ended before it began. Her nights were still haunted by fragments of memory, the sting of the epidural, the hiss of the oxygen line, Sienna's trembling voice whispering, he promised it would be fast. The sound replayed in her mind like a broken lullaby. Therapy helped, but healing was not linear. That sounds like something Mom would say. He looked at her for a long time and nodded. Maybe I finally learned it from her. The world had moved on from the Carver case, but inside the walls of the estate, the past still breathed. It lingered in the quiet corners, in the faint smell of Catherine Carver's old perfume, in the heavy silence between a father and daughter learning how to live with everything they'd lost and everything they'd survived. Autumn had come early that year. The lake shimmered with copper light, and the trees bowed under the weight of gold. Elizabeth stood at the window of her childhood room, watching the reflection of the wind across the water. For the first time in a long while, she didn't see the hospital room or the monitors. She saw peace, even if it was temporary. Behind her, the door opened softly. William entered, carrying 2 mugs of tea. He'd stopped sending assistants to do things for him months ago. I allowed the patient's oxygen to fall dangerously low. I did it because David Brennan offered me money. I thought I could control the outcome. I was wrong. The defense tried to rattle her. You're a convicted felon, Dr. Moreno. Why should the jury believe a word you say? She didn't hesitate. Because the only thing I have left is the truth. Her words landed like stone. By the end of the prosecution's case, the jury had heard everything: the affair, the payments, the recorded confession, the falsified medical reports. Even David's financial records painted a picture of desperation. The motive was as clear as the cruelty. When the defense began, their strategy was transparent: deflection and sympathy. Gregory Hart spoke in smooth tones, his voice like silk stretched over wire. My client is not a saint, he admitted, but neither is he a monster. He was manipulated by emotional women, by medical professionals who exploited his fear. He made mistakes, yes, but not murder. Since the trial, since the truth, he had taken to doing small things himself, as if to relearn the value of simplicity. Chamomile, he said, setting 1 mug beside him. Your mother swore it could fix anything. Elizabeth smiled faintly. Except you. He chuckled, the sound deep and unfamiliar but welcome. No, she was never quite that powerful. They stood side by side, sipping in silence. For once, the silence wasn't a void, it was an understanding. Do you ever think about her? Elizabeth asked. Every day, William said. But lately I think about her differently. For years I remembered her as an ending. Now I try to remember her as a beginning. Elizabeth turned to look at him. I used to blame you, for not being there, for hiding behind the company. I know, he said quietly, and you were right. Do you blame me for marrying David? He met her eyes. No, I blame myself for not teaching you what real love looks like. His words landed softly but deeply. Some nights she woke gasping, clawing at her throat, convinced the air was gone again. During the day, she smiled for Robert's sake. She played music in the mornings, read to him at night, tried to fill the house with warmth that her father's wealth could never buy. But beneath the rhythm of routine, there was an ache she couldn't name, something between grief and gratitude. One afternoon, she found William on the terrace, staring out over the lake. He looked older than his years, as if the victory had carved lines into his face that no rest could erase. Dad, she said softly, you should come inside. It's cold. He didn't move. Do you ever think about him? She hesitated. David? He nodded. Sometimes, she admitted, not because I miss him, because I'm trying to understand how I ever could have loved him. William turned to face her. You saw goodness where there was only calculation. That's not weakness, Liz. That's your strength. She smiled sadly. Elizabeth looked down at her mug. You think love is something you can teach? William smiled sadly. No, but you can model it. You can show it in how you protect, how you forgive, how you stay when it's easier to run. He set his mug down and walked to the old piano near the window. Your mother used to play this, he said, running his fingers over the keys. I never understood why. She wasn't very good. Elizabeth laughed softly. Then why did she play? To remind herself, William said, that perfection isn't the point. Harmony is. He pressed a key and the note lingered in the air, trembling and imperfect, but beautiful. She used to say I was too ruthless for music, he added. She was right, Elizabeth teased. Maybe, he said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. But I think she would have liked who I became after all this. Elizabeth studied him for a long moment. I do too. The judge entered, a woman with sharp eyes and a voice that carried authority like a blade. Court is now in session for the matter of the people versus David Brennan. The defendant is charged with attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and insurance fraud. David's lawyer, Gregory Hart, rose smoothly. Your Honor, my client pleads not guilty. A murmur ran through the room. The judge's gavel struck once. Noted. William felt Elizabeth's grip tighten. He leaned closer and whispered, It doesn't matter. The evidence speaks louder than his lies. The prosecution began its case with methodical precision. Detective Sarah Walsh took the stand first, detailing the events of the sting operation, the recording, the confession, the corroborating evidence. The video played on a large screen. There it was, David in William's study, relaxed, smiling, boasting of the plan as though he were explaining a business deal. His words filled the courtroom, every syllable damning. Later that night, Elizabeth sat by the fire with a photo album spread across her lap. Robert was asleep upstairs, and the house was quiet except for the rhythmic crackle of wood. She turned the pages slowly, her mother holding her as a baby, her father smiling in rare candid moments, birthdays, holidays, laughter frozen in time. William joined her, sitting across from the fire. "You still keep those?" he asked. "Mom's," she said. "She kept everything, even the bad years." He nodded. "She believed a memory was medicine. I thought it was poison." Elizabeth closed the album. "Maybe it's both." They sat in silence again, watching the flames. "I've been thinking," William said finally, "about what comes next." "For us?" "For all of it," he said. "The company's in good hands. The foundation is yours now, whether you want it or not. And I'm tired, Liz. Tired in ways I didn't know existed." She frowned. "You're not dying, are you?" He smiled gently. "Not yet. It doesn't feel like strength." "It is," he said quietly. "You gave people chances. I took them away. That's the difference between us." They stood in silence for a while, the lake mirroring the gray sky above. Finally, she said, "What about Sienna? Do you think she'll ever forgive herself?" William sighed. "She's rebuilding. That's more important than forgiveness." "You helped her," Elizabeth said. "You didn't have to." "I did," he replied, "because you asked me to, and because I saw what she could have been, before he turned her into something else." Elizabeth touched his arm gently. "You always talk about them like pieces on a chessboard." He looked at her, his eyes softening. "Because that's what it felt like. Every move had to be perfect. One mistake, and I would have lost you." She squeezed his hand. "You didn't lose me. You found me again." That night, William sat at his desk and wrote in his journal for the first time in years, just ready to live differently. Elizabeth leaned forward. "You deserve that. For the first time, you actually deserve rest." He laughed softly. "You sound like your mother." She'd agree with me. He gazed into the fire, the glow reflecting in his eyes. "Your mother believed that love should be gentle. I used to think she was naive, but she was brave in ways I wasn't. I used power to control. She used love to change people. I think she was stronger." Elizabeth's voice softened. "You used to call that weakness." "I know," he said, "and I was wrong." She reached out and took his hand. "Maybe you both were strong in your own way. She built love. You protected it. Maybe that's what kept me alive. Not one of you, but both." He didn't answer, but the faint tightening of his fingers around hers said enough. The next morning, they visited Catherine's grave together. The air was crisp, the sky a deep, endless blue. Robert toddled between them, his small hands swinging between theirs. David took the stand himself against advice. He looked thinner, worn, but he still carried that slippery confidence. "I panicked," he said. "Liz's pregnancy was dangerous. I didn't know what to do. Dr. Moreno told me complications were likely. I trusted her. I never told anyone to harm my wife. The things I said in that recording, I was confused, angry, drunk. It wasn't real." The prosecutor rose slowly. "You expect this jury to believe that your detailed hour-long confession was just a drunken fantasy?" David's jaw tightened. "People say things when they're under pressure." "And were you under pressure when you took out a $15 million life insurance policy on your wife?" He hesitated. "That was for protection, for our child." "And when you promised Sienna Morgan you'd raise that child together?" David didn't answer. The prosecutor stepped closer. "Tell me, Mr. She thought it was the happiest night of her life, the night she'd finally meet her baby. But inside that hospital room, the people she trusted most were plotting her death. Her husband, a tech CEO drowning in debt. His secret lover, a nurse who believed every one of his lies. Together, they cut off his wife's oxygen during childbirth to steal her fortune and her future. But when her billionaire father found out, he didn't call the police. He declared war. Using power, precision, and cold vengeance, he built a trap so perfect, the killers confessed on camera. This isn't justice. This is ruthless love, the kind that burns everything in its path to protect what's left. Stay till the end, because once you hear how far a father will go for his daughter, you'll never forget it. He wrote not about the trial or the victory, but about Catherine, his late wife, Elizabeth's mother. He wrote how he'd failed her once by burying himself in work after her death, and how he'd nearly failed their daughter by mistaking control for protection. I used to think love meant sheltering those you care about from the world, he wrote. Now I understand it means standing beside them when the world collapses, even when you can't stop it. He closed the journal and looked toward the framed photo of Catherine on the shelf. She's safe now, he whispered. You'd have been proud of her. In the weeks that followed, Elizabeth and William began to rebuild their lives. The estate, once cold and cavernous, began to feel like a home again. Elizabeth started the Maternal Safety Initiative, a foundation dedicated to training medical staff to recognize signs of abuse in expectant mothers. It became her mission, her way of transforming pain into purpose. That evening, the two of them sat on the porch, watching the sunset bleed into the horizon. Robert chased fireflies in the yard, his laughter echoing across the water. Do you ever feel guilty for what you did to David? Elizabeth asked quietly. William didn't look at her. No, he said, not guilt, but I do feel altered, like something in me burned away with him. Would you do it again? He turned to her, his expression unreadable. Without hesitation. Elizabeth nodded. Then don't regret it. I don't. You shouldn't have to carry that, he said. The thought that vengeance saved you. It didn't, she said. You did. The difference matters. William leaned back, his gaze on the horizon. You sound like someone who's finally made peace, she smiled faintly. Maybe I have. Peace isn't forgetting, Dad. It's remembering without bleeding. He looked at her then, really looked at her, the woman his daughter had become, the strength she carried, the gentleness she'd kept. I allowed greed and fear to replace judgment. I can't undo it, but I can take responsibility for it. The judge looked at her for a long time before speaking. Dr. Moreno, your actions nearly cost 2 lives, but your cooperation has ensured justice. 3 years in federal custody. Eligible for parole after 2. She bowed her head, whispering, thank you. In the back of the courtroom, William watched silently. He didn't applaud, he didn't smile. When she was escorted away, he stood and left. That evening, he returned to his estate. Elizabeth was sitting on the terrace, her baby asleep in her arms, the sunset painting her face in gold. When she saw him, she smiled faintly. It's done, he said simply. She nodded, rocking the child gently. What will happen to her? She'll serve her sentence. Then she'll have her chance to rebuild. Elizabeth looked down at the baby, then back at her father. You gave her that chance? Well, he hesitated, then said, you did. I just carried it out. For the first time, he felt not just pride, but awe. You know, he said softly, for most of my life, I thought the world was made of winners and losers. But maybe it's just survivors and healers. I was the first, you're the second. Elizabeth leaned her head on his shoulder. Then maybe we finally make a good team. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a wash of rose and violet. The lake mirrored it perfectly. Still, luminous, endless. For the first time since the night everything fell apart, William Carver felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Not power, not control, just love. Quiet, undeserved, and real. And for Elizabeth, it was enough. 3 years had passed since the night Elizabeth Carver almost died, and the world had settled into a rhythm she once thought impossible. At the opening ceremony, she stood at the podium, her father beside her, and spoke to a room full of doctors, nurses, and survivors. When I almost died, it wasn't just because of medicine gone wrong, she said. It was because people looked the other way. Fear and manipulation thrive in silence. My father taught me that power can destroy, but it can also protect. So we're using ours to make sure no woman ever has to be silent again. The applause that followed was genuine. Even William, who disliked public displays, felt something stir in his chest, something close to pride, though it carried a touch of guilt. Later that evening, Elizabeth found him standing by the car, staring at the engraved plaque on the foundation's wall. In honor of Catherine and Elizabeth Carver, proof that strength can be inherited. Mom would have liked it, she said. He smiled faintly. Your mother believed in compassion. You turned it into action. That's more than I ever managed. The media had long since moved on to fresher scandals. The Carver Foundation had become a respected institution in maternal health advocacy, and the Carver estate, once a fortress of secrets and silence, had turned into a place of laughter, light, and the smell of morning coffee. Elizabeth had changed. The fragility that once lived in her eyes had given way to something quiet but unbreakable. She still had nightmares sometimes, ghosts that came without warning, but she no longer woke in panic. Instead, she'd walk into her son's room, watch his chest rise and fall, and remind herself that she had won. Not against death, not against betrayal, but against the darkness that had tried to define her. That morning, sunlight spilled across the kitchen as she made breakfast for Robert. He was 6 now, all curiosity and motion, forever asking questions she couldn't always answer. Mom, he said between bites of toast, did Grandpa always live in a big house? Elizabeth smiled. No, honey. Brennan, how many people does it take to carry out an accident? Because from where I stand, it looks a lot like murder built on greed. David's facade cracked. You don't understand. I had no choice. You always have a choice, the prosecutor snapped. The judge's gavel cut through the noise. That's enough. The closing arguments came 3 days later. The courtroom was weary, but the weight of truth hadn't lessened. The prosecutor stood before the jury, her voice steady and deliberate. David Brennan was not a desperate man. He was a calculating one. He orchestrated every step of this tragedy, because in his mind, love was leverage and death was profit. But justice, ladies and gentlemen, is the one transaction he could never control. The defense spoke next, appealing to doubt, to sympathy, to fatigue. But their words felt small against the mountain of evidence. Grandpa built everything he has, brick by brick, one stubborn day at a time. Robert grinned sad. Like Legos? Exactly like Legos, she said, laughing, but with more paperwork. From the doorway, William watched them, his daughter and grandson, 2 miracles he'd nearly lost to greed and neglect. His hair was whiter now, his gait slower, but his presence was still solid, still commanding. There was a gentleness to him these days, though, something time and redemption had carved into his edges. Breakfast diplomacy? He asked, stepping into the room. Trying to convince your grandson that eating eggs will make him strong, Elizabeth said. I prefer waffles, Robert replied solemnly. Smart boy, William said. Negotiation skills. He'll make a fine executive one day. Elizabeth smiled. Or a firefighter. That's his current dream. William crouched beside the boy. A firefighter, huh? That's an honorable job. They save people. Robert nodded. Just like you saved Mommy. Elizabeth looked at him with warmth. You did your part, Dad. You made sure I got the chance. But peace, even when earned, is fragile. One night, William received a letter in the mail. No return address, but the handwriting was familiar. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Mr. Carver, it began, I wanted to thank you. Because of you, I'm still alive. I'm not the same woman who stood in that delivery room. I don't expect forgiveness. I only hope to make something good out of what's left of me. Please tell Elizabeth her kindness saved more than one life. S.M.M. William folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his journal beside Catherine's photograph. He didn't show it to Elizabeth, not because he wanted to hide it, but because he knew she didn't need the reminder. She was already living her forgiveness, whether she admitted it or not. The words landed between them softly, but their weight was undeniable. William felt something twist in his chest, a mix of pride and sorrow. Maybe, he said gently, but Mommy saved herself too. Elizabeth met his eyes and smiled faintly. It was true. He had opened the door to justice, but she had walked through it alone. Later that day, they visited the cemetery, the same one where Catherine Carver had been laid to rest more than 2 decades ago. The air was crisp with the scent of pine, the leaves whispering overhead like old prayers. Robert ran ahead carrying a small bouquet of daisies. Elizabeth watched him kneel before the stone and place the flowers carefully. "For Grandma," he said proudly. William joined his daughter at the edge of the path. "He reminds me of you at that age," he said, "curious, fearless, too kind for the world." Elizabeth looked up at the gray sky. "You say that like kindness is a weakness." "I used to think it was," he admitted. "He said it was mercy," he bragged. "She even cried while doing it." The room was silent except for the faint hum of the audio. Elizabeth closed her eyes, trembling. William watched without flinching. He had seen it too many times to feel shock anymore. Only the steady, controlled satisfaction of inevitability. When the video ended, the prosecutor turned to the jury. "That, ladies and gentlemen, is not speculation. It is confession. Greed dressed as grief. Murder disguised as mercy." Then came the witnesses. Sienna Morgan took the stand first. Her voice was small but clear, her face pale under the courtroom lights. "He told me she was suffering," she said. "He said she begged not to live through another complication. I believed him. I thought I was helping." The prosecutor nodded. "And what did he promise you in return?" Tears filled Sienna's eyes. "He said we'd raise the baby together, that it would be ours. Now I know it's the rarest kind of strength." They stood in silence for a while, listening to the wind. Finally, Elizabeth asked, "Do you ever think about David?" William's jaw tightened. "Not often. When I do, it's not anger I feel. It's pity." "Pity?" she repeated. He nodded slowly. "He built his whole life on lies, thinking that control was the same as power. But power without love is empty. I used to believe in control too. That's what makes us both dangerous men." Elizabeth took his arm. "You're not dangerous anymore, Dad. You're human." He smiled faintly. "That's progress, I suppose." A week later, the Carver Foundation held its annual charity gala. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers, laughter, and the hum of conversation. But the tone was different this year. Less about wealth, more about purpose. Photographs of mothers and newborns saved through their programs lined the walls. That night, as he watched her tuck Robert into bed, he realized that for the first time in years, his home was filled with life instead of ghosts. The war was over, but the aftermath was where meaning had to be rebuilt. William poured himself a final drink and raised it silently to the portrait of his wife. "For her," he said, "and for the ones who came back from the edge." Outside, the lake shimmered beneath a rising moon, its reflection calm, unbroken, eternal. 6 months had passed since the verdict, but time hadn't erased the echoes of that night for those who had survived it. Justice had been served, the guilty imprisoned, and yet redemption, the most elusive form of peace, was still being pursued quietly by those left behind. In a small Montana town far from the flashing cameras and courtroom headlines, Sienna Morgan now lived under a different name, Emily Chase. Each image was a quiet victory, a life preserved because one family had turned tragedy into action. As the evening drew to a close, Elizabeth took the stage. She stood at the podium, her father seated in the front row, Robert asleep against his shoulder. The crowd fell silent as she began to speak. "3 years ago," she said, her voice steady, "I almost didn't make it here. I almost didn't make it anywhere. But someone refused to let that be my ending. My father, a man who believed in logic, not miracles, until he was forced to create one. People ask me if what he did was right. I don't have an easy answer. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe justice shouldn't look like vengeance. But love doesn't always follow the rules." She paused, scanning the crowd. "What I know is this. When the system fails, when people lose faith, what saves us isn't money or influence. It's conviction. The belief that doing nothing is worse than doing too much. That's what this foundation is built on." When the judge dismissed the jury for deliberation, the room exhaled as though it had been holding its breath for days. Hours passed. The press waited outside like vultures. Inside, Elizabeth sat quietly beside her father. Finally, the bailiff called, "All rise." The jury filed back in. The forewoman stood, holding a slip of paper. Her voice didn't shake. "On the charge of attempted murder, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, guilty. On the charge of insurance fraud, Guilty. The judge nodded, her voice even. Mr. Brennan, you have been found guilty on all counts. You are hereby sentenced to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, whispers, flashes. David's knees buckled. He turned once toward Elizabeth, eyes pleading, desperate. But she looked through him, not at him. As guards led him away, she whispered, "Goodbye, David." Not perfection, not power, just the stubborn will to protect what's good. Applause rippled through the room, soft at first, then swelling into something powerful. William felt his throat tighten. He had spent his life chasing success, but in that moment, watching his daughter speak her truth, he realized this. This was the only legacy that mattered. After the gala, they walked out together under the glow of city lights. Elizabeth took his arm as they crossed the street, the sound of her heels soft against the pavement. "Mom would have been proud," she said. "I know," William replied, "but she'd have scolded me for taking so long to learn what she already knew." Elizabeth laughed. "She always was ahead of us." "She still is," he said, looking up at the stars. "Every time you speak, I hear her voice." That night, William couldn't sleep. He wandered through the quiet halls of the estate, the moonlight spilling through tall windows. Her apartment was modest, one bedroom, thin walls, the kind of place where every sound of life felt close and human. The walls bore no photographs, no traces of her past, only a small calendar and a vase with a single white flower. Each morning, she walked to the hospice center on the edge of town, where she worked in administration and volunteered with patients during lunch breaks. The staff called her gentle, selfless, kind, words that once would have made her smile. Now, they only felt heavy. Kindness, she had learned, was not about words but about repayment. On her first day, she had stood outside the hospice doors, staring at the sign above them. St. Helena's, where dignity meets compassion. The irony wasn't lost on her. Once she had betrayed both dignity and compassion. Now she spent her days helping others find them before they died. The patients didn't know her story. He paused at his study, where the chessboard still sat untouched on his desk. 3 pieces remained, a king, a queen, and a pawn. He picked up the pawn, the smallest, simplest piece, and turned it in his hand. "Sometimes," he murmured, "the smallest move changes everything." He set it beside the queen and smiled. Checkmate. Outside, he could hear the faint sound of Elizabeth singing to Robert, her voice carrying down the hallway. A lullaby Catherine once sang to her. It was soft, imperfect, but full of life. William sat back, letting the sound wash over him. The edges of his world had softened, the sharpness dulled by something better than victory. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in decades, sleep came easily. The next morning, Elizabeth found him sitting on the porch, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise. "You're up early," she said. "Couldn't miss this," he said. "Every sunrise feels borrowed these days." She sat beside him. Every seat was filled. Reporters with notebooks poised, cameras flashing as though light itself could capture the full extent of human corruption. The banners outside read State of Illinois versus David Brennan, but to William Carver, this wasn't the state's trial. It was his. He sat in the front row beside Elizabeth, her hand clutching his. She wore a simple black dress, her face pale but resolute. The child was home with a nanny, far away from this spectacle. For Elizabeth, this wasn't about vengeance anymore. It was about closure. But for William, closure and justice were the same thing. David Brennan entered the courtroom flanked by his attorneys. He was thinner now, the arrogance stripped from him, though not entirely gone. He looked out into the crowd and found William's gaze waiting. There was a flash of something in David's eyes, defiance, pride, perhaps even a plea. William didn't blink. The bailiff called the room to order. "Do you ever think about what comes next?" William nodded. "Every day, but not with fear anymore. Just curiosity. I've spent a lifetime controlling outcomes. Maybe it's time to let things unfold." Elizabeth smiled. "That's growth." He glanced at her, the corner of his mouth lifting. "Or surrender. Either way, it feels good." Robert came running out onto the porch, still in his pajamas, holding a drawing. "Look, Grandpa, it's you, me and Mommy." William took the paper, studying the uneven crayon lines. Three stick figures, smiling under a sun too large for the page. Above them, in Robert's uneven handwriting, were three words, "My family's safe." William's eyes stung. "It's perfect," he said. Elizabeth leaned her head against his shoulder, her voice soft. "He's right, you know. We are." They sat there together, the billionaire, the survivor, and the boy born from both tragedy and grace, watching the sun climb higher over the lake. To them, she was just Emily, the woman who brought blankets, listened without judgment, and read stories when the nights grew too long. But every time she sat beside someone's bed, she remembered Elizabeth Carver's eyes, wide, terrified, and full of disbelief, as the oxygen line twisted under her trembling fingers. That image never left her. It had become her penance, her shadow. One afternoon, she sat with an elderly patient named Margaret, whose frail fingers clutched hers as she drifted in and out of sleep. "You're very kind," Margaret murmured, her voice a whisper. "Were you always this way?" Sienna hesitated, then said softly, "No, I wasn't." Margaret smiled faintly, eyes half closed. "Then you must have learned the hard way. That's the best way to learn." Sienna swallowed hard. "It was hard," she admitted, "and I hurt someone who didn't deserve it." The old woman squeezed her hand weakly. "Then keep being kind. It's the only apology the world understands." In that golden light, the past didn't feel like a wound anymore. It felt like a lesson, one they had all survived to tell. And for the first time, William Carver understood the difference between justice and peace. Justice ends the war. Peace teaches you how to live afterward. He looked at his daughter, his grandson, and the quiet world around them, and whispered a final truth, one that needed no audience, no applause. "Love isn't soft," he said. "It's steel. It bends, it breaks, but it never disappears. That's grace. And it's enough." The lake shimmered in the morning sun, calm and endless. The story of the Carvers, their pain, their vengeance, their redemption, had finally found its stillness. And somewhere in the rustle of the wind through the trees, Catherine's voice seemed to whisper back, "You did well, my love." They walked slowly up the path until the marble stone came into view. Catherine Elizabeth Carver, beloved wife and mother, 1970, 1899. Elizabeth knelt and brushed a few fallen leaves from the inscription. "Hi, Mom," she whispered. "You missed a lot." William stood behind her, silent, his eyes wet but steady. "She'd have loved to meet him," he said, glancing at Robert. Elizabeth smiled. "He's got your stubbornness." "Poor boy," William said softly. Robert, too young to understand, placed a tiny toy truck at the base of the grave. "For Grandma," he said proudly. Elizabeth blinked back tears. "Thank you, baby." They stood there for a long while, the three of them, past, present, and future woven together in a moment that felt both heavy and light. When they turned to leave, Elizabeth looked back one last time. "Do you think she'd forgive you?" William looked at the grave, then at his daughter. "She already did," he said. "You're proof of that."